The sky was cloudy and the plane's engines hummed as it ascended into the early morning air. Ibrahim, the president, settled into his seat. Despite his role as the head of state, he was no stranger to travel. This was part of the routine: official trips, diplomatic meetings, and endless hours in airports or planes. But that day, something felt different. The atmosphere in the cabin was more charged than usual, and Ibrahim could sense it even before the plane had reached cruising altitude. It wasn't the kind of day where anything seemed out of the ordinary. The passengers were going about their business, some talking in hushed tones, others absorbed in their books or headphones. It was the calm before the storm. Ibrahim glanced at his watch as he adjusted his seatbelt, aware of the many meetings awaiting him once he arrived. As president, he was always expected to be prepared for any situation, but nothing in his experience could have prepared him for what was about to happen. The first sign of trouble came suddenly, as the captain's voice came over the intercom. His tone was serious, and Ibrahim instantly knew something was wrong. "We have a situation on board," the captain said, voice slightly shaking. "Please remain calm and do not panic. We are handling it." The brief message sent a ripple of anxiety through the cabin. The low murmur of confusion grew louder as passengers exchanged nervous glances. Ibrahim's heart rate increased, his instincts kicking in. A crisis on an airplane wasn't something he had dealt with before, but he knew this was far from ordinary. Without hesitating, he pressed the call button and summoned his chief of security, who was sitting a few rows ahead. The staff was already on alert, but they were tight-lipped, likely under strict orders to keep the situation under control and quiet. As the minutes passed, it became evident that something far more serious was unfolding. A man whose identity remained unclear had started causing a scene in the cabin. From what Ibrahim could gather, the individual had been acting erratically and had attempted to enter the cockpit. The flight attendants, visibly anxious, were doing their best to subdue him, but it was clear that the situation was escalating quickly. At that moment, Ibrahim's thoughts raced. Was it a hijacking attempt, an act of terrorism, or was it a case of mental instability? The uncertainty was unnerving. His mind quickly shifted to the bigger picture, how this situation could spiral out of control, and what would happen if they weren't able to regain order quickly. Inside his mind, the strategies for dealing with such a situation unfolded rapidly. His first instinct was to remain calm and give clear directions to the flight crew. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just about keeping the plane safe. This was about managing the narrative, making sure that no matter what happened, the world would see him as in control, calm, and capable. The plane's sudden, sharp turn jolted everyone upright, causing some to gasp in alarm. Ibrahim gripped his armrest tightly, feeling the tension in the air as the crew worked to subdue the man. He could hear muffled shouts and the sound of footsteps rushing through the cabin. There was no going back now. They were in the midst of a crisis that could define not only his presidency, but also the future of the nation. As he sat there, still strapped in his seat, Ibrahim couldn't help but wonder how this situation would unfold. What awaited him on the ground once they landed? Would the authorities be able to manage the situation as efficiently as the crew had handled it on board? And more importantly, what would this mean for his political future? The uncertainty weighed heavily on him, but there was one thing Ibrahim knew for sure. He would need to remain steadfast, calm, and decisive, no matter what happened next. The plane's descent was unnervingly slow. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and as the wheels touched down, the relief was tempered by the lingering uncertainty of what awaited them on the ground. Ibrahim's grip on the armrest remained firm as the aircraft slowed to a taxiing speed, his thoughts racing with 1,000 questions. Despite the resolution of the immediate danger on board, the stakes were far from over. This was just the beginning. The airport was unusually quiet for a typical landing, and as the plane taxied to its designated gate, Ibrahim noticed the increased security presence along the tarmac. Armored vehicles, police cars, and military personnel lined up at the end of the runway. The atmosphere was far from the usual calm routine of international arrivals. It felt like they were landing in the middle of a crisis zone, and Ibrahim's gut told him it was only going to get worse. Once the plane stopped, The emergency procedures kicked in. The flight crew, though clearly relieved, maintained a controlled composure. The moment the aircraft door opened, the president was immediately surrounded by security officers. He noticed that they were not just ordinary airport security. These men and women were highly trained operatives, speaking in low, urgent tones. Their presence alone told Ibrahim that the situation was far more serious than anyone had anticipated. As he stepped off the plane and onto the tarmac, he was escorted toward a black SUV waiting for him. The usual warm reception he was accustomed to on foreign trips was replaced with a sense of urgency and restraint. His mind shifted from the immediate crisis to the broader, more pressing question. What had happened on the plane, and why was the world so interested in it? The thought of international media attention already beginning to swirl around the incident made him feel a knot in his stomach. He had to act fast, with precision, or risk losing control of the situation before it had even begun. Ibrahim was quickly briefed by his top security advisor, who informed him that the man who had caused the disruption on board was in police custody. He was a foreign national with ties to extremist groups, but it wasn't immediately clear whether the act was coordinated or simply the result of a personal breakdown. Either way, the incident was about to send shockwaves through the country and the international community. As they sped through the city, Ibrahim felt a weight settle on his shoulders. The question was no longer just about how to deal with a security breach. It was about how to handle the fallout. How would the media spin the story? How would his political adversaries seize the opportunity to undermine his leadership? The need for damage control was urgent, and as the convoy neared the presidential palace, his mind shifted to how he would address the nation. He was going to have to speak publicly and fast. This was the kind of crisis that demanded immediate action from a leader, not just behind the scenes, but directly in front of the cameras. Ibrahim couldn't afford to wait for the dust to settle. The country needed reassurance that their president was in control, that the situation was being handled with the utmost seriousness. The world needed to see his decisiveness and his unwavering leadership. As he entered his office, the weight of the responsibility hit him harder than ever. The media would be waiting for a statement. The political opposition would undoubtedly begin questioning his leadership. And in the midst of it all, the people would look to him for clarity. But Ibrahim knew that how he handled this moment would shape not only the rest of his presidency, but also the future of the nation. The stakes were high. Ibrahim's first order of business was clear. He needed to ensure that the story was tightly controlled. He needed to appear calm and in control, not just for the sake of the country, but to send a message to the international community that his leadership was unshaken. His press secretary entered the room and briefed him on the current media landscape. Stories about the incident were already beginning to circulate, with mixed reports on the man involved and his motives. Ibrahim nodded solemnly. He could feel the weight of every word he would soon speak to the press, each one potentially altering the course of the nation's future. He stood up, adjusting his suit, and moved toward the podium, ready to face the cameras. As the door opened to the press room, the flash of cameras greeted him, and the murmurs of journalists filled the air. The room fell silent as he began to speak, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of urgency. The situation aboard the flight has been resolved. We are in full control. The safety of our citizens is our top priority, and we will not let any attempt to destabilize our country succeed. We are actively investigating the incident, and I assure you that those responsible will be held accountable. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a man who knew his next steps would define everything. The room was still as he finished, but Ibrahim knew that behind the closed doors of the media outlets, the spin would begin. Would they believe him? Would they see him as a strong leader, or would his enemies twist this crisis to their advantage? As the press conference ended, Ibrahim knew this was just the beginning of a long battle, not just for his political future, but for the stability of his country. The road ahead was uncertain, and the true extent of the crisis had yet to reveal itself. But one thing was clear: he was in the fight of his life. The press conference had barely ended when the media frenzy began to spiral out of control. Ibrahim sat in his office, watching as reporters on television dissected his every word. Some hailed his calm demeanor as reassuring. Others questioned his handling of the crisis, suggesting that it was more serious than he let on. The political opposition, always eager to capitalize on any sign of weakness, wasted no time in attacking his leadership. Back in the palace, Ibrahim could feel the weight of his political adversaries closing in. From the moment the plane touched down, it was clear that this incident was going to be more than just a simple security breach. It would test his ability to maintain control, not only over his government, but over the public perception of his leadership. His advisors were already drafting responses, but Ibrahim knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. The opposition parties were already framing the incident as a failure of his administration's security apparatus. They claimed that such an attack should have been prevented, and questions arose about how the authorities could have allowed an extremist to board an international flight with such dangerous intentions. The opposition leaders began to demand investigations into the security lapses that allowed the terrorists to even board the plane. Public calls for resignations within Ibrahim's security team became louder. Yet, Ibrahim was not entirely concerned about these political jabs. He had faced worse. What was troubling, however, was the international response. World leaders were already issuing statements of concern, with some suggesting that Ibrahim's government was not taking the threat of extremism seriously enough. The international media, too, had latched onto the story with alarming speed, framing it as part of a larger pattern of instability in Ibrahim's country. For the first time, the international community's perception of him and his administration was at risk of becoming irrevocably damaged. At the same time, there was a growing sense of unease among his inner circle. While his closest advisors maintained a facade of unity, Ibrahim sensed a shift. Some of them were now more hesitant, more questioning of the decisions he had made. Rumors began to circulate that members of his cabinet were growing increasingly disillusioned, worried that this incident could be the tipping point for a political collapse. That evening, Ibrahim was scheduled for a private dinner with his closest allies, those who had stood by him through every scandal and challenge. As the guests arrived, the atmosphere was noticeably tense. Everyone could sense that the political storm brewing outside the palace walls was not just a temporary inconvenience. This could be the beginning of something far more serious. Ibrahim's chief strategist, a calm and calculating man named Rashid, was the first to speak after a few minutes of awkward silence. "We need to take control of the narrative, Ibrahim. If we don't, it's only going to get worse. The opposition will start pushing harder, and the international community is already second-guessing your ability to lead." Ibrahim nodded, feeling the pressure mounting. "What do you suggest?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with an underlying frustration. "We need to reinforce our position immediately. You need to address the nation again, this time with a clear strategy for handling the aftermath," Rashid replied. "But it can't just be words. You must outline concrete actions. We have to show the people that we are actively responding to this, that we're not letting it slide. Otherwise, your approval ratings will take a serious hit." Ibrahim took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair. "And if the people don't buy it? Then we fight back harder. Public opinion is everything right now. If they sense weakness, they'll turn on you in an instant. We need to regain their trust," Rashid continued, his voice unwavering. The conversation shifted as the dinner continued, with each advisor offering their own insights into how to manage the political fallout. Some suggested that Ibrahim deliver a speech outlining new anti-terrorism measures, while others recommended stronger military action in response to any potential threats. Yet, Ibrahim felt an undeniable sense of uncertainty. Every choice seemed fraught with consequences, and the political landscape was shifting beneath his feet. The next day, Ibrahim met with his communications team to prepare his next public statement. He needed to regain control of the message and present a unified front, both to the people of his country and to the international community. The last thing he wanted was for this crisis to spiral into a scandal that could engulf his presidency. "Prepare a statement, but make sure it's strong," he told his spokesperson. We need to outline a clear response to the security breach. What measures are in place now, what we're doing to prevent similar incidents, and most importantly, that we're not going to let this destabilize the country. His spokesperson nodded. Understood. But do you think we should address the opposition's calls for resignations? Ibrahim paused for a moment, weighing the question carefully. We can't let them dictate the terms. If we start responding to every little jab, it will only make us look weak. We stay focused on what matters, the safety of the people and the security of the nation. As the team finalized the messaging strategy, Ibrahim couldn't shake the feeling that the crisis was far from over. The international pressure was mounting, and the political fallout at home was intensifying. He knew the path ahead would be difficult. The coming days and weeks would test his leadership more than anything he had faced before. And with each decision, the stakes grew higher. Every move he made would have far-reaching consequences for his presidency and the future of his nation. But despite the pressure, Ibrahim knew that one thing was certain: he would not back down. This was a fight he had to win, both for his political survival and for the stability of his country. The battle for control had only just begun. As the days passed, Ibrahim found himself in a constant state of tension. Every decision, every word spoken, seemed to send ripples through the political landscape. The international pressure continued to build, with foreign governments calling for a more robust response to the security breach, while the opposition within his own country was relentlessly hammering away at his administration. The battle was now two-pronged. He had to quell dissent at home while trying to salvage his reputation abroad. In the midst of all this, Ibrahim had to consider his next moves carefully. The situation was no longer just about containing the immediate fallout from the attack. It was about preventing a full-scale collapse of his political authority. His team, including his closest advisors and strategists, had been working tirelessly on damage control. But even their most well-crafted plans seemed to be barely holding back the storm. Internally, Ibrahim faced growing unrest within his ranks. His cabinet members, once unwavering in their support, were now increasingly nervous. They were aware of the mounting calls for action, and they were beginning to wonder if Ibrahim's methods had run their course. Ibrahim could see it in their eyes, the uncertainty that was creeping in, the questioning whispers that circulated whenever he wasn't in the room. It was not just the opposition that posed a threat anymore. It was the risk of fragmentation within his own government. Ibrahim knew that if his support base cracked, his presidency could fall apart faster than anyone anticipated. But he was not someone who would show weakness, at least not publicly. He had built his entire political career on being the unshakable figure, the man who led with both strength and decisiveness. To let that image slip now would be catastrophic. That morning, Ibrahim summoned his most trusted aides and the key figures from his security team. He needed to discuss his next public address, a critical speech that could either reaffirm his control or further unravel his authority. He wasn't sure what the answer was yet, but he knew it had to be the right one. As he entered the room, the tension was palpable. His advisors, all seasoned and well-versed in crisis management, sat quietly, waiting for him to take the lead. Ibrahim could sense their anxiety, but he refused to show any sign of vulnerability. "We've analyzed all the angles," Rashid, his chief strategist, began, breaking the silence. "The international pressure will only intensify. We have two choices. We either stick to the current line and continue with a defensive stance, or we make a bold move and initiate a more aggressive strategy." Ibrahim sat back, stroking his chin thoughtfully. His mind raced through the options, weighing the risks and rewards of each approach. "What's the bold move you're suggesting?" he asked, his tone calm but filled with the undertone of command. "We take control of the narrative," Rashid replied. "We announce new sweeping reforms to our security apparatus. We show the world that we are committed to fighting extremism with every resource at our disposal. But more importantly, we turn the tables on the opposition. We accuse them of undermining national security by politicizing this crisis. It could shift the focus away from our administration's shortcomings and onto their own opportunism." Ibrahim was intrigued but cautious. And the international community, what will they think? They'll be skeptical, but they'll respect a decisive response, Rashid said. If we're seen as being proactive, we can reframe this crisis as a demonstration of our commitment to stability. But we can't afford to wait too long. Public opinion is shifting every day, and if we don't act decisively, the opposition will. Ibrahim's mind raced through the implications of such a move. On the one hand, it could rally his supporters and present him as a strong, decisive leader. On the other, it could escalate tensions with foreign powers who were already questioning his leadership. He needed to be careful. One misstep, and the entire situation could spiral beyond his control. "Prepare a draft of the speech," Ibrahim ordered. "I'll take a look at it later. But we also need to start preparing for potential international reactions. I want to speak with the ambassadors from our key allies." As his advisors went to work, Ibrahim took a moment to reflect. He knew that his next move would be pivotal. His decision would not only determine the course of the crisis, but also shape the future of his presidency. But despite the overwhelming pressure, Ibrahim was determined to face the challenge head-on. The thought of backing down or showing fear was unthinkable to him. He had spent his entire career fighting for control, and this would be no different. The next few days were a blur of meetings, speeches, and strategy sessions. Ibrahim spent countless hours rehearsing his public address, fine-tuning every word to ensure that it conveyed the right balance of strength and resolve. He couldn't afford any mistakes. The world was watching, and one wrong move could mean the end of his political career. When the day of the speech arrived, the atmosphere in the palace was electric with anticipation. Ibrahim stood before the cameras, flanked by his advisors, the weight of the world on his shoulders. As the broadcast began, he took a deep breath and began speaking, his voice steady but carrying the full force of his authority. "People of our nation," he began, "what has happened to our country is unacceptable. We will not stand by while those who seek to destroy our way of life attempt to sow chaos and fear. We will fight back, and we will win. Our security forces will be reinforced, and we will work tirelessly to ensure that such an attack never happens again. We will not let the forces of terrorism divide us. Together, we will stand strong." He continued, his words growing more impassioned with each sentence. "To those who seek to use this tragedy for political gain, know this: we will not allow you to undermine the safety of our nation for your own ambitions. The time for petty politics is over. This is a time for unity, for strength, and for action." As he finished, Ibrahim knew that the speech had struck the right tone. But as he watched the reactions unfold, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the true battle was only just beginning. Would his words be enough to maintain control, or would the political forces closing in on him finally break through? The crisis had not been resolved, and the next few days would be critical. But for now, Ibrahim could only hope that his decisive stance would buy him the time he needed to regain control and save his presidency. The days following Ibrahim's speech were marked by a mixture of tense anticipation and a slowly escalating series of events. The initial public reaction was cautiously optimistic, with many praising his decisive stance and his unwavering commitment to national security. But as the hours passed, cracks began to show. His message, though strong, had not been enough to silence the growing discontent on both the domestic and international fronts. At home, while some of his core supporters rallied behind him, the opposition began to regroup. The speech had not been the game-changer Ibrahim had hoped for. Instead, it had fueled the flames of dissent. Critics, both within his own political party and in the broader opposition, seized on the contradictions in his words. The accusation that the opposition was politicizing the crisis was seen by many as a defensive maneuver, and those who had been silently questioning Ibrahim's leadership now felt emboldened to speak out more openly. Even his closest allies, who had initially praised the speech, began to show signs of uncertainty. Ministers who had once been fiercely loyal started voicing their concerns more candidly behind closed doors. The cracks in the facade of his administration were widening, and Ibrahim could sense the beginning of a shift in power dynamics within his government. His political capital, once considerable, was starting to erode. Internationally, the reaction was a mixed bag. Some nations, particularly those with a history of supporting Ibrahim's regime, offered tepid praise for his resolve. They acknowledged his public commitment to security, but voiced concern over the harshness of his rhetoric. Others, particularly the European Union and human rights organizations, condemned his speech for its divisiveness, accusing him of stoking internal tensions and using the crisis to consolidate power. Ibrahim's once strong alliances with foreign powers began to show signs of strain, and diplomatic efforts to ease the tensions only seemed to highlight the deepening rift between him and the international community. Despite the mounting pressure, Ibrahim refused to back down. He convened a series of private meetings with his top advisors, where the conversations grew more intense. The stakes were higher than ever, and the time for subtlety and finesse had passed. The president had to decide whether to double down on his aggressive stance or attempt to make a strategic retreat and try to salvage what was left of his political legacy. His advisors were split. Some, like Rashid, urged him to press forward, to take even more drastic measures to secure his position. They argued that the only way to regain control was through absolute dominance, using the full power of the state apparatus to crush dissent before it could gain momentum. Others, however, cautioned against pushing the situation too far. The public mood was volatile, and any further missteps could lead to widespread unrest or even outright rebellion. Ibrahim knew that his administration's survival depended on regaining the initiative, but he also understood that he couldn't afford to alienate too many people, both domestically and internationally. The political balance was fragile, and any wrong move could lead to catastrophic consequences. As the political crisis deepened, Ibrahim faced a crucial decision: escalate the conflict and risk total destabilization, or attempt a last-ditch effort at reconciliation, rather hoping that his reputation for strong leadership would carry him through. It was a high-stakes gamble, and the weight of the decision hung heavily on his shoulders. In the coming days, Ibrahim tried to regain control by pushing for a series of economic reforms aimed at alleviating the growing public frustration. He also began to soften his tone, making overtures to the opposition in an effort to show that he was willing to listen to their concerns. But these gestures were seen by many as too little, too late. The damage had already been done. As protests erupted in several cities, the president's attempts at peace-building were overshadowed by the rising tide of discontent. The streets were filled with voices demanding his resignation, with growing calls for change from all sectors of society. Ibrahim's grip on power was slipping, and he could feel it. Finally, as his government teetered on the brink of collapse, Ibrahim was forced to make a painful decision: to resign. In a tear-filled address to the nation, he announced that he was stepping down in the face of the overwhelming demands for his departure. His voice was steady, but heavy with the weight of defeat. For the good of the nation, he declared, it is time for new leadership. The speech was broadcast across the country, and within hours it was clear that Ibrahim's political career had come to a bitter end. His resignation marked the official end of an era in the nation's history, and the transition to a new government began almost immediately. Ibrahim left the stage not as the strong, unshakable leader he had once been, but as a man who had been consumed by the very forces he had tried to control. His legacy was forever altered, defined not by his triumphs, but by the failures that had led to his downfall. In the aftermath, the country entered a period of political transition and uncertainty. The future was unknown, and many wondered what the next chapter of the nation's history would bring. Ibrahim had fallen, but the crisis he had faced was far from over. The wounds of his presidency would take years to heal, and the true cost of his decisions would only become clear with time. The country once again stood at a crossroads, and as the dust settled, the people began to wonder, what would it take for them to rebuild, and who would rise from the ashes of this political turmoil to lead them forward?